John Patrick Shanley joins me in the chat cave this week, but before we get to the interview, friends, are you subscribed to Coming Up Next? It's very simple and very quick to do, and it costs you nada. All you got to do is go to comingupnext.com.au, hit the button for iTunes, for Stitcher, or for Podbean. Go on Spotify, you can find it there. Hit the subscribe button. The show's going to come at you free each and every week, automatically downloading to your device of choice. You support the show supports your podcast listening habits. Let's get on with this week's interview. It's podcast time, friends. Welcome to another episode of Coming Up Next, the podcast. Shout out, thank you, and all the praise to my guest last week. If you haven't seen Three Identical Strangers yet, it's still playing. If you're listening to this on release day or release week even, at the Nova Cinema in Melbourne. Check your local listings to find out when it's playing. Tim Wardle was my guest last week, and he's the director of the phenomenal documentary that I just mentioned, Three Identical Strangers. Listen to the ramble at comingupnext.com.au. All the archives are available there for nothing. That's like over 163 hours at least of philosophical rambles with top creatives. And Tim Wardle was top of the list before this week, but this week is one of those rare opportunities where if I didn't have a podcast, I wouldn't get to speak with, any of the people that I speak with. Well, most of the people that I speak with. But this week in particular was a really special and mind-blowing ramble that I got to have. John Patrick Shanley is one of the most legendary contemporary playwrights of all time. I used to sit in classrooms and hear his plays, Danny and the Deep Blue Sea, The Dreamer Examines His Pillow, Doubt, to name a few. Seeing Moonstruck for the first time. He's an Academy Award-winning screenwriter, as well as one of the most prolific playwrights. And while I was in New York, I had the tremendous privilege and pleasure of going around to his apartment, sitting down with an amazing sweeping view of Manhattan and picking his brain for an hour about his life and his career. You know, the usual kind of musings that we do here on the show. If you happen to be in New York City, in the area, or close by in late October, October 21st to 25th to be exact, 16th Street Actors Studio and the Australian Theatre Company are actually putting on a workshop with John, so you can get on the floor and work with him. For more information on that, australiantheatrecompany.org. If you're not already subscribed, comingupnext.com.au is going to be your best bet. But in the meantime, please, ladies and gentlemen, kick off your dancing shoes and enjoy my philosophical ramble as John Patrick Shanley steps into the chat cave. It's pretty amazing to sit here with you looking at this kind of sweeping view of Manhattan. Thank you very much for inviting me into your home.
Oh, my pleasure.
I kind of always am thinking about how do you start these podcasts? How do I start the conversations? Normally I try and just go into a point of interest or something that's kind of relevant to the person I'm speaking to's current body of work. But I felt like with you and with my current I've been having this dilemma, I suppose, about how do I keep the podcasting and this show, how do I keep the fire burning for myself? Mm-hmm. Because I'm finding that I'm at a point now where I've been doing it for 3 years, as I was saying to you before, and I'm not entirely sure how to keep evolving it. And I was wondering how you managed to find, or if you've ever had a point in your career where you've had that sort of point where you're like, I don't know if I can keep doing this, or I don't know how to keep it fresh, I don't know how to keep it interesting for myself, as well as for the people as well as for the audience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly anybody of any interest goes through coming to the place in the woods that's dark and they're not sure which way to go forward, or trudging through an endless desert in the ever eroding belief that they're going to come to a place where there is water. And those are both decent metaphors for the creative search for fresh vitality, well springs, that we all go through, but in fact that it's not even creative, it's life itself. How do you reinvigorate? How do you make the old tricks new? How do you find your life again? Because life, you have a life, and then you report on that life, and then you are distanced from that life, in part by your reporting of it. And you can, when you ask somebody like, what do you like? What kind of person are you? They almost invariably describe who they were, not who they are. Because the current environment, the current space you inhabit is a wordless space that words chase after but never quite overtake. As a creative person, I've been a writer for 50 years, and easily, actually more than that, but I'll just arbitrarily say 50. And I'm 67 now, so I've certainly, since I was 11, been doing this. Been doing some version of writing. I was writing little poems and little snippets of stories and stuff like that. But the organic impulse was there.
Do you remember what the first thing that you ever wrote was?
I'm not sure that I remember the first thing. I remember the sort of genre that I was interested in to begin with, which was kind of Edgar Allan Poe territory, of a guy who has a dream about murdering somebody and wakes up with a bloody knife on the pillow, that kind of thing.
And a raven overhead.
Yeah. Not as sort of incantory as the Raven or Annabelle Lee, but certainly slightly flavored by that. And I don't think it was particularly that I'd read Edgar Allan Poe and wanted to be like him, but that stage of my life, that there was an impulse that was similar to the impulse that Poe had. It was more about that, what his preoccupations were overlapping with mine during that, young time in my life. So I had no, problem writing for many years. I had one problem, and that was that I wasn't writing well. But other than that, things were going swimmingly. And you have to go through moments where you turn around and you suddenly see yourself, and you realize that you have to change. And those are big moments in a person's life, in a writer's life, in an artist's life, and where you actually become tired of who you are, and have to molt like a bird and grow new feathers in order to, survive the next winter. And I've had many moltings over the years, and I would say that actually I just went through one where I wrote and directed a play in the fall called The Portuguese Kid, which was a comedy that I did with Jason Alexander and some other very good people. And it was a farce, basically, and which has enormous mechanical demands, because when you do a farce, once the audience starts laughing, they have to keep laughing. I mean, that's what the job is. It's like, how do I keep this going? And so, the preview period, which was like a month long, was unbelievably intense, where I was rehearsing all day, and then I was rewriting at night, and then I was getting up early in the morning and rewriting again, and then going to rehearsal and putting in the changes. And that was going on for like 2 solid months that I was doing that. And very intense effort. And at the end of it, there was a great deal of laughter in the audience, and I came away exhausted and thinking, yeah, now I don't want to do that. You know, I just did that, and now I don't want to do that, maybe for a long time.
Yeah.
And then I kind of knew, I said to a friend of mine, last year turned out to be a very busy year for me in theater and then film. And I said to a friend of mine in December, I said, I don't think I'm going to work all next year. Not by choice, but by karma. I think that everything's going to dry up and blow away now. And that's exactly what happened.
That kind of cycle, has that been an experience that you've had over the years?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And sure enough, like 2 weeks into the new year, I got a pinched nerve, the sciatic nerve in my leg, which I'd never had before, and it was very painful. And I went to, chiropractor, this one and that one, and nobody could quite heal it, but they all said the same thing. You can't sit down. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm a writer. They said, no, you can't sit down. I'm like, well, for how long? And this we can't say, but you can't sit down. And so at first I just went ahead and sat down anyway. And literally, the minute I sat down, I would have an attack. It was that fast. So my body, which was sort of like my neglected wife, had come to me and said, you need to spend some more time with me. And we need to go for long walks together, because apparently long walks are good for this ailment. And I don't really give a shit about your writing. I don't really give a shit what else is going on. You need to attend to the other side of life. And so after a struggle of a couple of months, me fighting that, I gave in to that, and then things got better. And then I'm, cured the sciatic nerve problem, and I changed my lifestyle a decent amount to become much more physically active, and I didn't sit at the keyboard for as long as I would have previously, but I'd already become pretty good at writing mostly in my head, and then when I sit down I write pretty quickly.
Didn't want to get a stand-up desk?
I thought about it, I never got there. I may get there eventually. I don't seem to care about that, whether or not, if that turns out to be the solution, then that'll be the solution. But the big new thing was just like, first the intuition that you're going to go through a period where you're not going to work. And of course, because I'm older, you go like, well, it could lead to never working again. And then it's like, yeah, but you can't live in fear. You can't worry about these things. You're going to go on and do whatever the hell you're going to do. And so quite recently, I wrote, like in the new year, I wrote a new movie on spec, and then I wrote a third of a second movie on spec, and then I also wrote a significant short story in terms of density and language and structure, and I haven't written a short story since I was 25. And so that opened a door, and I realized that I needed to put aside the second screenplay I was working on and just stop doing anything for a while. And then I immediately wrote a full-length play, which I now have a first draft of. And so, but you have to have a certain faith. You can never do the writer's life or the artist's life or the human life out of fear. You've got to, you have to acknowledge that you're afraid that you'll never write again, or that nobody will ever want to hire you again, and then go on from there to make the choices that you need to make as an artist and a human being.
Yeah. And, looking over your career, at least the work that's been in the public eye, from the sort of beginning of your playwright career in the 80s, through to, the early 2000s, there's kind of very clear points where you've obviously had one of these molting kind of moments. Mm-hmm. I suppose in those times, were you aware that that was what was happening? Were you making conscious choices, or were you just going with what you were feeling in your gut?
I would know that I was going into crisis, and of different sizes. And, one of the things about having lived for a while now is I have now the frame of reference of, you have been through this before.
Yeah.
One of the most wonderful reading experiences of my life was the Memoirs of Casanova, which is like 10 volumes. And I have read them all and cried when it was over, because he basically stops in the middle of a paragraph because he died, Right. And he in the start of the memoirs, he talks about these various romantic adventures he has in falling in love with this one and that. And then at a certain moment, a decent way into the memoir, he falls madly in love with a woman, and he says, for the first time, but I had felt this way before. And it's one of the saddest and yet transcending moments in all of my reading life, was the moment when I heard this guy come to that self-knowledge and what it meant for his future. And coming to that place in my own life where, felt like I was never going to work again, or I never had anything to write about again. He said, I have felt this way before. And that's very consoling and gives you a real sort of base. And reading, like reading autobiographies and biographies of people is very helpful to know, I'm not alone. A lot of other people have had this experience and went on to have very interesting lives.
I recently read Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, and I was so kind of taken by how, I guess, humble he is in the way that he presents his life and the way that he appears to imagine his life, and how kind of the kind of path that he's taken to get to where he is today, where he's been playing for 50 plus years. And I left the book feeling a very intimate kind of understanding or knowledge of who this guy is, and it really helped my kind of, I guess, fuel my creativity or my creative soul. So yeah, I guess to your point about looking at other autobiographies or biographies to feel like there is this commonality of creativity that exists, and people have these common experiences of fear or doubt or whatever it may be, and then find a way to persevere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I met Bruce Springsteen a couple of times. So one time was at Lincoln Center. We were doing a tribute to Tom Hanks's career, and Tom had asked me to, speak, and several other people, including Bruce, and we were backstage, and it was time for me to go on, and I turned to Bruce, and he had his guitar strapped on, because he was going to go out and sing something from Philadelphia, and I said, "Could I borrow your guitar?" And he started to take it off, and then he suddenly sort of woke from a dream, and he went, I was going to give you my guitar. I've never told anybody that story before.
That's quite funny.
So he is humble,
Yeah.
as opposed to saying, "What the fuck you mean? You've got to fuck off." No, he was quite sweet.
In the book, he describes being in the room with people like Mick Jagger, and it's not that he feels like he doesn't deserve to be in the room, but he acknowledges the kind of largesse of these people and how amazing it is that he does get to be in the room with these people who are the top of the game. And I think that's, that was something that I suppose I didn't expect going into the book.
Yeah. I think a lot of people who find themselves in that situation, find themselves in a, room with Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks and whoever, that there is a voice in your head going like, I'm in a room with Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks and whoever. But it's it's a child's voice, really, I think, and doesn't have much to do with the work, the work that you need to do on any given project that you're involved in. I remember one time I rewrote this movie that Sean Connery wanted to do. So they called me up and they said, Sean Connery, suggested your name, And I said, oh, that's lovely. And so they said, would you be willing to talk to him? I'm like, well, sure. So I get on the phone with Sean Connery and I said, look, I'll rewrite this screenplay and you don't have to pay me. And if you don't like it, just forget the whole thing. And if you like it, then you got to pay me. And he said, being a Scotsman, he said, oh, sounds good to me, right? So I rewrote it, and he did like it. And so they ended up on a plane going to Spain to his compound to work on and talk about the screenplay. And so I get there, and it's long. You fly to Rome, connect to something else, and now I'm in southern Spain in some rich enclave on the sea. And I go, and then I get in a cab, and I've been traveling for probably 14 hours, and I finally arrive at Sean's place, and he greets me at the door, and his wife, who's lovely, and then he immediately takes me into the backyard. He said, to read the screenplay. I'm like, yeah, okay. So, we go in the backyard, and he's got a mural by Cocteau up on the wall and all of this stuff, and it's Sean Connery, right? And so he basically says, you read all the other parts, and I'll be the hero, right? And so I'm like, okay. So we're sitting in the guy, and I'm acting and he's being Sean Connery, and he's reading it with great commitment, and he's a good actor. His part, and we get to a love scene, and I'm the woman, and he's, looking into my eyes, and I'm like, how did I get here? How did I end up in this situation? And where I'm the love interest of Sean Connery.
It's James Bond. Looking deep into my eyes.
James Bond is my, childhood experience, and then you end up, in the room with the guy, and in this completely incongruous scenario.
Yeah, I mean, you grew up in the Bronx in the 50s, which I could imagine would be a very grounding experience.
Yes,
and fast forward to, I'm assuming this was in the 90s that you're writing this screenplay with Sean Connery. And, even, last year, like you said, working with Jason Alexander, you worked with Meryl Streep, meeting Bruce Springsteen backstage, all of these incredible artists. Is there something that you kind of feel is a kind of common thread through these people that has helped them to get to the levels that they've gotten to from your point of view?
Well, they're all somebody, They're not kind of looking at you going like, I'm not really sure who I am, but, what do you think? Now, they might ask you what you think, but they're really at home in their bodies, and they become very comfortable being Tom Hanks or being Sean Connery or, being Meryl. I suppose one of the reasons that I've gotten along so well with people like that is I'm also myself, and so they kind of recognize that, and they go like, okay, so he's not like trying to like have some kind of apocalyptic conversation with me about the meaning of life, where he's just, like, let's get on with it.
Yeah.
And they're usually very let's get on with it too. So we're all on this. These people are all workaholics. That is the truth. And so I'm probably the laziest person in every meeting I've ever been in, because they work like demons. I mean, Tom is doing full staff in L.A. on stage right now on a break between I don't know how many films. He's chosen to go on stage and do one of the most challenging roles in all of Shakespeare in a fat suit. God bless him. You know, I mean, they can't get enough of it. It must be really fun to be an actor, because there's no other reason I can think of to do it so much.
I guess to go back to what we were speaking on before about these kind of shedding or molting moments, do you feel that through these moments that your process as a writer has evolved? I mean, it must have kind of inevitably evolved through these experiences, but you know, when it came to writing something like Danny in the Deep Blue Sea or The Dreamer Examines His Pillow versus writing Doubt or even The Portuguese Kid, how do you feel your creative process has differed?
Well, for many years, you know, first of all, I became visible to a larger audience as a result of Danny in the Deep Blue Sea. So that was in 1984. I'd already been writing plays and putting on plays for 10 years at that point, and working on the invisible play. And I would do, you know, I'd have a production about once every year and a half somewhere at a small theater. And people would sometimes say, boy, the play would be better if you did this or you did that. And I would resist all such suggestions, because I knew that when I rewrote something, it was worse. I did not have the ability to improve it by rewriting it. It would become more and more false. And so, and I think a lot of writers have this experience at a certain point.
Is that because you start to overthink it?
I just didn't know how to do it.
Right.
You know, I might not have articulated it that way, but that was sort of the truth of the matter. And then I tried a couple of times. You know, somebody would have a lot of notes. I said, well, let me try. You know, I did this one play called Rockaway, and I wrote the play, and I liked the play, and then I got a director who was very Sanford Meisner kind of actor, which I like Sanford Meisner's point of view very much, and he gave me all his notes on it. He's a really old guy, and so he's from like an earlier time. And I said, well, you know, as an exercise, I'm going to do all the notes this guy said. So I rewrote the whole play as per his notes, and people agreed that it was better. And I said, yeah, but I don't like it. You know, it's not what I want to do. This isn't what I want to do. And that was the last time that I took literal notes for a long time, because the whole thing was still too mysterious to me. And then at a certain, much later point, I began to be able to rewrite, which is a very exciting thing, a skill to develop. And I think it was for doing screenplays, because they're so structural that you start to get the auto mechanic side of yourself going, and it's really helpful in figuring out how to rewrite. And a lot of people who give writers notes don't understand the problem. They think they're speaking English to the writer, and the writer's understanding what they're saying, and then the writer simply won't do it as far as they're concerned. They just won't make the obvious necessary changes. But I know it's not the first thing a writer needs to know is that you understand what they're doing. And the way to do that is to talk about what in what they're doing is alive. The rest of it doesn't matter. That's just dead. People explaining to you what doesn't work is like describing the space around you when you ask, what do I look like? You need somebody to tell you, because you don't know. You're in there, you're writing it, so you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And they assume on some basic level that you know exactly what you're doing, what you're putting out, and you don't. And so they need the living tissue of what they're doing described back to them. I mean, I did this one play called Gorilla, which was a very silly play about 10 apes set loose by a misanthropic zookeeper in Central Park, right? And it was great fun, and it was what it was, and I only had limited skills to get it to where I wanted to be. But somebody said something to me afterwards that, and I don't even remember who it was, that changed my life. They said, that one character, there was one gorilla in it that was very inarticulate and in a lot of pain from loneliness. And they said, that was a great character. And I wrote Danny the Deep Blue Sea. I was like, I'm going to do one about, the inarticulate pain, which I knew so well. And it was, said to me at the right time when I was ready to express those things. But it was, that kind of, how could you know that was going to be the thing? But in other words, they were describing, out of a play that had like 14 people in it, one character, and just saying, that's the character that's interesting, and this is why, and leaving it at that. It was a matter of a sentence, the person, maybe 2 sentences, they said to me.
And that inspired
That suddenly revealed to me the living tissue in what I was doing, so that I could write a play from that living place. And they could have said 10,000 things about what was wrong, what could be improved, what was funny, but there was a central thing I didn't understand that I needed somebody to mirror back to me.
And so from that, well, actually, I suppose I'm actually quite curious if you recall what the opening night of the first show that you ever put on was.
Oh, I remember very well.
And what you were feeling.
The first show I ever did was at New York University. I'd gone back. I went in the Marines. I'd been in NYU for a year and dropped out, and then I went back after the Marines and a bunch of odd jobs and stuff, and I got accepted back into it and started up again. And I liked writing, so I took all the writing courses, which there weren't that many. And then I saw there was one called Introduction to Playwriting. So I took that, and he was supposed to, the cumulative action of the course was you're supposed to write a 1-act play. So I immediately wrote a full-length play. And it was put on. The student body, producing body, chose to put it on, and it went into rehearsal 3 weeks after I wrote it. And the director was one of the faculty, and he was like an older member of the faculty, and he had all sorts of ideas about what should be done to the play, and also what I thought were very bad ideas. And so I just stayed away because I knew he couldn't change the play if I wasn't there. And they put it on, and the actors chose not to wear their costumes but to wear clothes that they thought were cool, stuff like that. And then they sometimes made up lines. And the first performance of the play was in a 300-seat house. And one of the actors said a line that wasn't in the play, and it got a laugh. And I leapt up and yelled at the audience, "Don't encourage them." So I remember it very well.
Something that you've said a couple of times is about, or kind of around the idea of, as the writer, understanding what your stories that you want to tell, or what your kind of vision for the piece is, which I imagine is also why you've directed most of your own shows. Is that something that you kind of grew into, or is that something that you that you always kind of felt like you knew what your vision for these shows were?
My dream was that, my idealization was that I write a play and I'd hand it to a brilliant director who would make it much better than I had made it, and that I would reap all the glory and financial gain from that. And the reality turned out to be that I ran into a stream of incompetent directors who I quickly just pushed to the side and said, no, I'm not going to allow you to destroy my play because you have a dream of control. And because the directors, you remember, they would say to me, don't talk to the cast, talk to me, and I'll talk to the cast. And I'm like, fuck that. I'm going to talk directly to the cast. You got to be out of your mind if you think I'm not going to do that. I have occasionally had happy experiences seeing things that I wrote that I didn't direct, and wish that I had more. Because I remember when I started directing plays, I'd done a play called Women of Manhattan, and I was very unhappy with the result. I didn't like the production, and the next one, I'm like, I'm directing the next one. That's the story. That's it. And it was a play called Italian American Reconciliation, and I did it. The way that I did it, I gave it to some guys in Los Angeles, a couple of cowboys kind of guys. They wanted to do this play in Los Angeles, so I said, okay, I'll give it to you for $100, because I just, I like the adventure of the unknown of these seem like very earnest guys, and maybe they'll do a great job. And then I got a call from them saying that they just fired the director, and would I take over? And I said, okay. So I got on a plane and I went to Los Angeles, and I took over the direction of the play, and it went very well. And then I did it in New York with John Turturro and Johnny Pankow and a wonderful cast. And it went very well, and I enjoyed doing it, and I enjoyed working with the designer Santa LaQuasto a lot and everything else. But it came about out of the incompetence of a director. They're just sort of like, this guy can't do this. Many of the times that I've directed plays have been because I didn't see the person who I thought would do a better job. I still like the idea of somebody else doing a better job. They just don't very much.
Yeah. It makes it kind of hard to acquiesce.
I mean, Barnett Kellman did a great job on Danny and the Deep Blue Sea. Did a wonderful job. And Doug Hughes did a great job on Doubt. Norman Jewison did a great job on Moonstruck. So I've had, Tony Bill by Alchemy, because it was a crazy set, did a great job on Five Corners, my first film. So, Frank Marshall did a great job on Alive. So I've had, decent amount of success using other people, and would enjoy to do it again. Because I'll never forget starting rehearsals for Italian American Reconciliation in New York. I went into the room, stage management tables all set up, my table's there, notepad or whatever, and the cast is there, and then the sort of meet and greet from the producing entity, Manhattan Theater Club, and then the door shut, and I suddenly realized I can't get out of here. When you're the playwright, after a couple of days, you'll say, I'll go out for coffee, I'll be back tomorrow. You can never leave.
Yeah.
If you leave, they'll stop working. And that was rough for me because it's exhausting to be in a room with very intense people who invariably get very frightened at about 2 weeks of rehearsal that they're never going to get it, and you're the only thing standing between them and the door. And that's always, it's very, very exhausting to be the playwright and the director at the same time.
Do you feel as though your experience in service, during the Vietnam War, helped your work ethic and your ability to do something like be the writer and the director?
Well, definitely I became, as a result, I was not in Vietnam. I was in during the time in the Vietnam War, but I wasn't. My brother Tom was in Vietnam. And I was in the Marine Corps, and I came out of it. When I went back to college, when I got to college the first time, I found it overwhelming. And when I went back to college the second time, I'm like, what was the problem? Mm-hmm. This is a piece of cake. And so I did. I had learned a great deal. I used to get up at 5 o'clock every morning and write for 3 hours before I started my day at NYU. And that was kind of great. And I got a tremendous amount done, and I got to do a lot of the bad writing that I needed to do.
What sort of things were you writing? Was it just like stream of consciousness?
Anything that came up. No, I wrote a novel, and after a year I burned it because I realized it didn't have a plot. And I also, all of the papers that they assigned and everything, I would write all of those. So by like 8 o'clock in the morning, my major work for the day was done, which is kind of a great feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As you were kind of talking about incompetent directors and not being allowed to talk to the cast when you did have them, I'm kind of struck by, as I'm looking over your life, the threat of anti-authoritarian or like kind of fuck you to anyone who tries to, in a way, tell you what to do.
I ascribe to the best idea in the room, and I see it as my job to be the person who has the best idea in the room a decent amount of the time, but also to have the humility and street smarts to recognize when somebody else has a good idea and take it and run with it. I don't really, I don't like judges. I've had a couple of times where I had to deal with a judge, and I discovered that I really don't like him. I don't like anybody who sits higher than I do. It brings out the Irish anarchist in me. I just want to burn down the building. It's like, who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? And when you go through a divorce, it's an interesting thing because you're in there and you're dealing with, at a certain point, you're dealing with a judge, and yet you didn't do anything wrong. So it's sort of like, I didn't do anything. Okay, I stole this guy's car, and I got to deal with a judge. I don't like it, but I understand it. It's like, I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you in my life? Why are you able to tell me what to do with my life? But of course, we do need judges. I just don't like them very much.
Well, I read an interesting quote that you said back in 2004, I think, and it's getting harder and harder in society to find a place for spacious, true intellectual exchange. It's all about it's all becoming about who won the argument, which is just moronic.
Yeah.
And when I read that quote, I was thinking that's truer today than it ever has been. If you look at the whole kind of fake news epidemic.
Well, there's a culture of advocacy. And so let's say, you do end up in a lawsuit, or you end up in a criminal proceeding, or whatever you end up in, and they go, seaplane landing.
Oh, wow.
They go into court, and your lawyer argues a slanted argument to win. The lawyer is not committed to the idea of telling the story fairly or honestly, but distorting it completely in your favor. And the other lawyer is doing the exact opposite, distorting it against you. And the judge watches these two distortions and is supposed to apply the law to them. I find the whole thing a little crazy. The idea of a commitment to, well, who is representing the idea? Nobody. Of what actually happened, what is right and wrong about it. And in society, I feel that most of our politicians went to law school and they learned that idea of advocacy, and then we ended up with television shows, finding a compelling television to have people yelling at each other, and there are shows like names like Crossfire, which suggests violence. And it is the idea of people, donning white robes and going into a place to reason their way to a fair outcome, a just outcome. I don't see where that exists in modern society.
It's interesting that through, a lot of your plays, the upfront kind of representation with some of these characters is that they're quite, they're big, almost monstrous characters, but you're not presenting a kind of straight and narrow, like judgmental point of view. There's a lot of compassion that kind of evolves throughout it. Actually, again, going back to something that you said about growing up in the Bronx, where you felt like the reason that you got beat up a lot was because you could so clearly see who people were, and that kind of comes out in your work a lot. I suppose, have you found it more difficult as, we've gotten to where we are in society now to have that level of compassion, or has it been easier to maintain?
Yeah, no, I don't find, the experience of living, if you're paying any attention, it teaches you that you are guilty of all of the things that these people who you dislike are guilty of, just maybe to a different degree. And that if you want to assess people's behavior fairly, you have to start by assessing your own behavior fairly. And if you're really willing to do that, it's pretty humbling.
Yeah. So when you did move into screenplay writing, and you wrote Five Corners and then Moonstruck, which you won an Oscar for Best Screenplay, did you feel like there was a quite significant change in all the doors? Well, it must have been in all the doors that were opening for you, but then in choosing which ones you wanted to walk through, there must have been a bit of a challenge.
Well, it was really Moonstruck. Five Corners was released by a Cineplex Odeon, which doesn't exist anymore, and at the time they never distributed a film. They didn't know anything about it. George Harrison put up the money, the Beatle, for it.
Oh, wow.
And
what was he like?
Never met him.
Right.
The director did, the producer did, the writer didn't.
Arguably the best Beatle.
But it was a nice thing that George put up the money, and it was released and it disappeared almost immediately. And then I did Moonstruck, and that was a big deal, a very successful film internationally as well as in the United States. And then at that time, the video cassette of Five Corners came out, and that's when my phone started to ring, because nobody'd seen the film, but everybody went to Blockbuster back then, and so then they all saw Five Corners, and it was sort of a double opening for that reason. The Moonstruck and Five Corners sort of hit just a couple of months apart, really. And yeah, all the doors opened, and at a certain point I ended up working with Steven Spielberg for several years, invisibly and visibly.
Right.
And that was a very good collaboration.
Was that at Amblin?
That was at Amblin. And Frank Marshall and Kathy Kennedy, who were at Amblin at that time as well. And then after they left Amblin, I continued to work with them as well.
So this would have been like the late 80s, early 90s, really in the kind of sweet spot of his burgeoning career.
Actually, when I met Steven, it was probably a point at which he was he was kind of missing a beat.
Right.
And he, because he was about to do, or was in the process of doing Hook, which did fine financially, but it's not anywhere near his best work or most interesting work.
As a child of the late 80s and early 90s, I have very fond memories of watching Hook.
And as well you should. I did another movie with him called We're Back, and an animated film which I discovered to my horror about animation, that when you're in post-production, you're still in pre-production. That anytime Steven had another idea, it was going on for like years, and he'd pick up the phone, it's like, it's over. It was never over.
Yeah.
And they would make a couple more tweaks, and then they'd have to animate that, and then they go, but that was an interesting thing to do. And people who were little kids at the time that movie came out going, you wrote, that's the biggest thing I did, as far as they're concerned, because it's that moment in your life, you know, when you're sort of soft wax and things really leave a profound impression. But yes, I found myself in Hollywood and in a circle of people that was movie stars, studio heads, and directors and producers at every party, and it's just, whenever I went to, it was the same people, and I was like bored. I got bored, and I felt like I was sort of losing my oxygen supply. So I lived in a hotel in Chateau Marmont for like a year, making Joe versus the Volcano, which was a gigantic thing because it was 5 months of pre-production, 77 days of shooting, 6 months of post-production. It's just like, wow. Will this endless. Ever end? And can I ever go home?
Not live in a hotel room.
And it was Chateau Marmont, I think they're like apartments, so wasn't that bad as far as that. But I was really homesick. And then when I came back to New York, then the New York press didn't like the movie, and I took a lot of shit for it. I I'd hit one of those places where I had to reinvent myself and reassess what I was doing, and also crash emotionally big time, which took a couple of years.
Was it difficult to kind of step into the idea of not pursuing a career in Hollywood anymore? Was that
well? I was never, I always wanted to go home. So it was, and I continued to work in the film business quite a bit, but I was trying to figure out, what was a good fit for me, what made sense for me. And it's one of the terrifically difficult things about Los Angeles is it is a one-industry town. I remember going to the dry cleaner and him talking about the grosses of my film. And I was like, this is a nightmare.
Yeah.
In New York,
no
90% of everybody doesn't give a shit what your film did.
Yeah.
And out there, the dry cleaner treats you different if your film doesn't have a good weekend.
Yeah.
It's that extreme. So that was not for me. It's an interesting culture, and it's right now it's in the midst of a deep transmogrification that where it's going to come. The studio system is really on the ropes, and they have their tentpole movies, and the sort of human movies are going to Netflix and Amazon, if they're going anywhere, and nobody really knows what that means either. So we had this sort of heyday of cable shows like Breaking Bad and Sopranos and stuff, and then we got into this thing now, this territory where nobody knows what the hell's going on really, and I'm happy that I'm not in Los Angeles, and this is my whole life, and I have to deal with it all the time. It must be rough right now.
Well, I was speaking with a writer in Los Angeles. I was there last week, and he's a fairly prolific horror film writer, and he said to me, Silicon Valley has eaten Hollywood.
Yeah. Actually, they're eating everything.
Yeah, right.
It's not just Hollywood. I mean, Amazon they bought Whole Foods, and now they just bought a drug delivery company. So they want to go into prescription drugs,
right?
Movies, shirts, like whatever
Groceries.
You need, food. And I mean, nobody even knows what it means to have one company be the conduit for and have the potential to be the conduit for everything.
So after your experience of living in Chateau Marmont for a year almost and coming back to New York, you said that there was a couple years of coming down from that experience. When did you know that, this particular malting experience was finishing or coming to its evolutionary?
Well, a lot of stuff, happened because I had, during that period, adopted 2 children at birth, and which, that was enormous. And then I went through a divorce. And that was enormous. It's the other side of life, It's the pinched nerve.
Yeah.
You have to attend to all of these things. And all of that, soaked up a lot of time and life force and attention, as it should have. And I rode through all of it. I've had this what I call the closest thing that I've been to blocked was probably this year, and I've already written 3 scripts. So I'm like, well, if that's blocked, then I don't know, So,
what do you think of the idea of writer's block?
Well, I mean, I know it's real. It's just like, clinical depression is real, and the fact that I am not clinically depressed is something I should be grateful for, rather than go like, well, I'm not clinically, nobody's clinically. That's, of course, the insane narcissistic point of view of people who just never know anything about life.
And I guess that kind of comes back to that empathy or compassion that, I was speaking about before.
You see people, I mean, there's this guy, playwright and sometimes television writer, Stephen Adly Girgis, very good writer, and he has managed to make writing look like the most awful thing a person could do. I mean, the way this guy suffers, procrastinates, and I guess you could say blocked, except he's writing all the time. He just talks as if he's blocked all the time, but he actually is producing pretty much all of the time.
Yeah.
I always, back when I was working with Phil Hoffman, I would watch him in his dressing room in between, times when we were shooting, and he was so miserable. I remember saying to him, I said, if this is what acting is for you, why don't you just do something else, And of course, what I didn't understand was acting was the one thing that was working, So it can be so easy to misapprehend what you're seeing. And that was all that stood between him and total destruction, and in the end it didn't. So people have, we often get it backwards about people. You have a writer who's blocked. If they tell you they're blocked, they're telling you something, and it's and there's probably other words, other doors to be opened, other avenues to get into what exactly is going on with them. And I'm just, I'm thankful that I've not had a great deal of suffering on that front.
A lot of writers and actors who I know feel like they need that kind of suffering to create, and there's fear around the well of suffering drying up as well if they do too much
right.
therapy or work or whatever.
Eugene O'Neill didn't want to have therapy for that reason, and I think Arthur Miller also resisted it. I can't remember for sure on that front. I know O'Neill wouldn't do it. It's like he didn't want to tamper with the magic
the
or whatever,
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, obviously, everyone's experience is going to be unique to them. What's your take on that?
Oh, I don't. I think that actually that's just plain nonsense. But that in other words, that there is no sacred space that a writer may not enter to see what is there. That their job is like okay, if I'm afraid to go to a psychiatrist, I probably should go.
Yeah.
I've been to therapy a number of times, always in an emergency. And sometimes I knew it was an emergency and sometimes I didn't. But I've never had any interest in going long term because I said, well, when I stop paying this person, I no longer have a relationship with them. I don't want to share some of the biggest moments of my life with somebody who's going to pull the plug and disappear. I want that to be friends, family, things like that. But each to their own. Woody Allen, I'm sure, has had a long and rich therapeutic life.
Yeah. You mentioned Philip Seymour Hoffman before. Was the time that you're referring to when you shot Doubt? Was that the period of time when you were referring to?
I knew Phil before that for some years because we both were members of the Labyrinth Theater. Phil before me, and I came into it, and he was one of the producers of a play of mine, Where's My Money, at the Labyrinth, which I think was the first play that I did with them. And then we used to go on vacation together down to South Carolina to the beach with his kids and his de facto wife, Mimi, who was a lovely person who I knew as well as Phil. And so I had a pretty long relationship with him.
And so what was it like when you came to making Doubt into a film, to be working with him and Meryl, this kind of all-star cast?
Yeah, well, I asked Phil, I offered Phil the role, and he said, I have so much going on, but I'll look at it. So I sent the script over, and he called me next day and said, I'll do it. And then he talked to a mutual friend of ours, and he said, I'm a little worried about working with John. And I said, why? And he said, 2 alpha males. And then later, after we were doing the film, he said to another mutual friend of ours, he said, I was wrong to be worried. I like John as a director, which I will take to my grave because Phil was not like an effusive guy. And we were not, though we went on vacation together and worked together, I would never say that we were close. I certainly deeply respected his talent, but we were just very different kinds of people. And I think that he was probably more one tiger to a hill kind of a guy than I was and am.
Yeah. I feel like, we could probably keep talking about this and about your career. I mean, we just keep rambling on for a while. And we've only gotten up to Doubt. I'm really grateful for you allowing me to come into your home and look at this sweeping view.
It is nice, isn't it?
It's, it must be...
oh, look, there's a fireboat with all the hoses going right there.
I saw that going before and I was wondering what it was.
It's a fireboat.
It just seems to be spurting water onto water.
Well, they have to test it once in a while.
Right.
When there's a fire, it's too late.
You make a very good point. It must be incredible to kind of wake up and see this view. And
it is. I'll tell you, ironically, what I said when I first moved in. So he said, how is it, to wake up with that view every day? And I said, I feel like I'm on a permanent vacation in Sydney.
Really?
I've never been to Sydney. But this is sort of, that's sort of a lot of sky
Yeah.
and the water right outside. And it just seems a little more carefree than any other place I've lived.
Yeah, my brother lives not too far away from here, and he has this amazing view from his rooftop of Manhattan. And I definitely just kind of sat there in awe of what I was looking at as an outsider, someone who grew up in small town Melbourne. To kind of see, there's the Empire State Building, there's the Chrysler Building and the World Trade Center. It's
Ooh, now look at the fireboat. Now
Oh,
it's
wow.
going full bore. Holy mackerel. The jets of water are going up, I would say 50 feet. And there's like 8 of them.
So they're just testing it right now.
Yeah.
Well,
That's kind of magnificent. I've never seen that before all the years I've lived here.
wow. Well, I'm glad we could share this experience
That's
together.
true. A fountainhead.
A fountainhead.
All right. Well, good talking to you.
Good talking to you. I have one more question, which
Yeah,
is
okay.
which is how I end every podcast.
Yeah.
The question is, what makes you silly?
Well, I have a real silly and whimsical streak because I am a certain kind of Irish person.
Yeah.
And so whimsy is a weakness of mine. And I have to be careful in my writing. Occasionally I will get too whimsical.
Yeah.
And I've discovered that people don't really like that.
Have you had a particularly negative...
I try to confine it to my life now,
Okay.
outside of writing.
Yeah. Have you had any particularly negative or positive experiences from your whimsy that it might have gotten you into or out of trouble?
Oh, I've always had a part of my personality that I call the mad scientist, and it always starts the same way. A voice in my head goes, I wonder what would happen if I... and then fill in the blank. And it might be just to say to this a visibly homicidal maniac that I think that he has a very nice smile. I've done a lot of things like that.
Yeah.
Or you appear to be unhinged in a certain way. Are you a lunatic? I've been physically attacked for it.
Right. Thank you so much, Sean.
All right.